Microsoft founder Bill Gates has lauded South African scientist couple Professor Abdool Salim Karim and his wife Quarraisha for their work and contribution to the fight against HIV, AIDS and COVID-19. The philanthropist included the couple on his heroes list to talk about their journey and pioneering work. I'm joined now by Professor Salim Abdool Karim. Prof, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night. I know we normally have you on to come and talk about all the numbers, the infections and so on and so forth. But we're going to talk today about the work that you have been doing in epidemiology, at least for the last 30 years. First and foremost, how do you feel about the accolades, the nod given to you by the Bill Gates Foundation on the work that you've been doing on HIV and AIDS in the country?
I was just taken aback, at the, just the warm accolade that Bill Gates had provided to us. I wasn't expecting it, and I didn't know about it. So on World AIDS Day, I was having quite a busy day doing some talks and so on. I get home, and my daughter calls to say, "Have you seen this? Have you seen this?" And she sent me the link, and it was really exciting. It was just such a warm and wonderful occasion.
You are among some of the most respected researchers in the space of HIV and AIDS yourself, along with your wife. Put for us into context, what shapes your work as an epidemiologist in the last 30 years, particularly around the work you've been doing on HIV?
So my wife and I have been undertaking HIV research for just over 30 years. We actually started our first study back in 1989. It seems like a whole world ago, when you think now about COVID. And it started off with a study that she did. And I have to admit that the award probably is more for her than it is for me, because often she's the leader of much of our research and plays, a much stronger leadership role than me. I'm more of an accompanying spouse in some of them. But that initial study really, for the first time, helped us understand the unique nature of the HIV epidemic in Africa and how age-disparate sex between very young girls, teenage girls, and men in their late 20s and 30s, and how that was driving the HIV epidemic. And so that set the basis for us. We spent the last 30 years trying to find a way to slow down the spread of HIV to young girls. That's it. I mean, that's what we have for 30 years. That's what we've been doing.
You're saying you're a supporting spouse, really. That's the work that you've been doing. How did you meet with your wife, Quarraisha?
Well, we were both at the University of Natal Medical School back in the 1980s. And she came to use one of our very specialized pieces of equipment, an ultracentrifuge. And because I was the registrar in virology, I was doing my training in virology at the time, it was one of the pieces of equipment that was in my department. So as the controller of the equipment, she had to get my permission. And that's how we first met.
And she managed to get more than just your permission, I suppose.
Yes.
And what actually happened when, in '89, that said to you, we are now going to focus on the work on HIV? Did you have a personal experience? Did you encounter some kind of an experience, or was it something somebody said that sparked that interest?
So I had actually, I've been working in the Department of Virology, and as part of my training in virology, while I was there, HIV had been described, and the first test became available. And I gave my first lecture on HIV in 1985. That just tells you how far back. But what happened was that in 1987, I went to New York to go and study at Columbia University. And New York was a hotbed of HIV. I mean, you couldn't spend an hour in New York without HIV being in some shape or form hitting you. In the bus stops, it was all the talk. And there was so much of activism in New York City about this disease because we had no treatment. We just basically just knew it was a virus and people were dying, and it was just causing just ructions in our society. And so when we were in New York, we saw what was happening, and we realized that this was going to have a huge impact on South Africa. And so while we were in New York, we made the decision that when we came back to South Africa, both my wife and I were studying there, doing our master's degrees, that when we arrived back in South Africa at the end of 1988, that we will change our research and focus on HIV. So it was really the experience in New York, to a large extent, that impacted on us, that made us focus on HIV.
Now, coming and dedicating, I guess, much of your work, much of your passion, much of your energies to this type of work, how did the age and the era of AIDS denialism affect your work, but also affect, I suppose, the exchanges that you were having with your peers around the world when they looked at what's going on in your country and the type of research that you were doing at the time?
Well, those were difficult days, and days when our country was being ravaged by this epidemic. And we knew that, there was a treatment that was available. We knew it was expensive and we couldn't readily afford it. But we believed that it was a human rights issue. It was something that we had to fight for. And as scientists, we believed that these treatments should become available. And so we took on that challenge. And so when you take on that challenge, and then you have a situation where the president is saying HIV doesn't exist, it sort of fundamentally undermines everything you stood for. And it makes every HIV positive person, a situation where they're not recognized for their problem, and they not acknowledged as somebody who needs treatment, who needs care, who needs love. And that became a big challenge for us. Fortunately, we were able to move past it and introduce particularly nevirapine, mainly because of the activist community, the scientific community, all coming together. The AIDS 2000 conference played a huge catalyzing role in all of this. I mean, I can't emphasize enough the importance of President Nelson Mandela's address at the AIDS conference. I mean, he set the tone, he set the agenda, and he said that every HIV positive mother should be afforded nevirapine to protect their unborn children. So that created the impetus. And so it was just a matter of time before we looked beyond the denialism and went into an era where we began to introduce antiretrovirals. And as you know, today we are the country with the biggest AIDS treatment program in the world. Not something we should be proud of, but something that just reflects just the sheer burden, the reality that 1 out of every 5 people living with HIV in this world lives here in South Africa. Yeah. And that they very much part and parcel of the way in which we solve this problem. We solve it with them.
Now, one of the most powerful lessons that come from you, Prof, is the fact that your approach to science is largely collaborative. You believe that the people that you serve, the people that you're caring for, should really play a bigger role and have an input in the work that you are doing. Now, we heard from the Treatment Action Campaign during this World AIDS Day that we are seeing something that maybe we were asleep to in the last couple of years, that now children as young as 15 years old are beginning to show up with the HIV infection, and largely because of this phenomenon of sugar daddies, or one would say transactional sexual relationships. What do you say to that? I mean, in terms of the role that communities are playing, especially in the work that you're doing?
I think one of the lessons that HIV has taught the world is that when you're tackling a disease like this, which is fundamentally about society and about individual behavior, that you can only really solve it in the absence of a vaccine or a cure. You can only really solve it by working with people. And so very fundamentally, everything we do in HIV, we do in consultation with, and we do it in a partnership. And even if we're providing treatment, it's in the context of that kind of partnership. And that has been one of the strengths of the HIV response. But when you think about some of the innovations that we saw in HIV, some of those innovations were driven by the way in which we interacted between pharmaceutical companies, between scientists, between academics, between communities, and between the media, all of us working together. Just take, for example, one of the most important advances in HIV was to have a simple, rapid test that told you whether you're HIV positive or not in 5 minutes. That's it. It's cheap, it's easy, it's accurate. That changed how we looked at HIV. But that change, even though it's a technological solution, it came about because of the way in which we understood the nature of the problem and how we understood knowing a diagnosis as an entry point to treatment, as an entry point into prevention, could change the course of the epidemic.
Yeah. Now, you've mentioned this already, that one of the discoveries that you found in your work is you're doing research, and the last 30 years or so in this work, is that young women particularly bear a disproportionate burden because of this epidemic. And unless we address that, there is no way of us being able to control this epidemic. How do we address that?
We have a pretty good understanding now about the nature of risk in young women. So there's no question that the highest rates of HIV occur in young women, particularly the young teenage girls. When we try to understand why that's the case, we begin to understand that it's 3 separate things that come together. The first is at a social or societal level, where women's position in society, their ability to control their risk are all compromised. Gender-based violence, there's a whole range of things that happen. The second is individual behavior, the way in which young women choose to partner with older men, and what drives that in our society, that they would rather partner with an older man than with a man or with a boy in the same age. There's a whole range of things that go with that. And then the third is biology. So you've got society, you've got behavior, and you've got biology. And in biology, we understand that there are some young women, and it's quite a significant proportion, it's about 1/3 of the young women, they have a very unusual situation in their genital tract, where we see that they have little proteins that indicate to us that they have genital inflammation. This genital inflammation, it calls CD4 cells into the genital tract. And those CD4 cells are exactly the cells that HIV wants to infect. So in a way, these women are not just at risk, they have a hyper susceptibility to HIV because they've got these little proteins that are signals for CD4 cells to come in. So over the years, we've been able to piece together that young women are in this nexus where they're dealing with all of these factors together. And so their high risk needs to be sorted out in those 3 ways. You have to sort out the biology, you have to sort out the behavior, and you have to sort it out within the context of our society.
Now, speaking of biology, there's some interesting work you're doing with Quarraisha around neutralizing antibodies. Let's give us a brief overview of what that is.
Sure. So when a person gets infected with HIV, Put very simply, HIV is a retrovirus. When it enters your body, it will enter and it can only infect a cell that has the CD4 receptor. It will enter that cell and it incorporates its genome, its DNA into your host DNA. So it's going to be with you for life. That's why we can't cure HIV. Nobody has been cured of HIV except for the 2 people who had these transplants. So naturally, nobody can cure HIV themselves. They can't get rid of it for that reason. But what happens is that the body senses that there's this foreign virus in it. And what it does, it launches an immune response. And that immune response is generating antibodies. Now, the antibody that's generated normally will only kill that one HIV. But HIV has so much of variability. And that antibody isn't able to kill any other HIV. But in 2010, 2 groups, one at the organization called Scripps and one at the US NIH, both of them simultaneously described there are these rare individuals who can make a very special kind of antibody. An antibody that doesn't just kill their own HIV, but can kill lots of different kinds of HIV. And because HIV is so different, across people, across countries, across continents, to have somebody who makes an antibody that can kill all these different kinds of HIV is really very important and was discovered for the first time barely 10 years ago. So when that discovery was made, we didn't really understand how they could make it. And so we started doing research, and our team based at the National Institute of Communicable Diseases, led by Dr. Lynn Morris and Penny Moore, they provided the first description of how humans make broadly neutralizing antibody.
Wow.
And then we started looking for it. And when we looked for it, we found a whole lot of people who had this antibody. And we then investigated them and found these antibodies. We were able to manufacture it. And now we are testing it to prevent HIV.
Wow. That is some fascinating stuff, Prof. Unfortunately, we're out of time and we could have you for the whole day. But because of time, we just wanted to say congratulations. We've seen the accolade and we wish you all the best in your work that you're doing, and particularly the work that you're helping us with right now in the nation in the fight against COVID-19.